What happens when a king raised in blood inherits the crown? The year is 1547. The air over England is heavy, thick with smoke, silence, and sin. The fires of Henry VIII's reign have only just died out, and yet, beneath the ashes, something stirs. The great monasteries that once fed the poor now stand hollow, their doors nailed shut. Church bells hang mute over empty villages, and in the ruins where monks once prayed, rats run over the bones of saints. From this silence rises a child, barely 9 years old, a boy who has never known hunger, never known mercy, and never been told no. They place upon his thin head the same crown that crushed his mother's heart and severed his father's soul, and call him king. Edward VI, the son of England's butcher, a prince raised not in warmth, but in fear, schooled to see sin in every face, rebellion in every whisper, and purity only in fire. His tutors taught him that God's will was law, and that to doubt it was to invite damnation. They filled his ears with psalms and prophecy until his prayers became weapons, his faith a blade sharper than any sword. Beyond the palace gates, the kingdom he inherits lies broken. Fields once green with harvest are fenced and empty. Men who once worked the soil now wander the roads as beggars, hunted for the crime of starvation. Mothers hush their children when the name Tudor is spoken. The people remember Henry's fury, but they do not yet know his sons. Because this boy, this pale and pious child, believes he is chosen to cleanse England of its sins, to strip away its idols, to burn away its doubt. In his mind, cruelty is purity, and every cry of pain is a hymn to heaven. The courtiers bow before him, the nobles smile through fear, but in the shadowed corridors of Whitehall, the old servants whisper that the boy's eyes gleam too brightly when the talk turns to judgment, too coldly when the word mercy is spoken. England has survived a tyrant. It is about to meet something worse, a tyrant who believes his cruelty is holy. What his father began, the tearing of churches, the breaking of bodies, the bleeding of the land, Edward will perfect. And he will do it not out of rage, but out of faith. He will do it with the calm conviction of a saint. He will do it with a smile. Before we step back into the smoke of Tudor England, make sure you're subscribed to Echoes of Time, where the past still whispers. He was never meant to rule, not like this. Edward was born into a world already fractured, baptized in the echo of his father's sins. Before he could speak, he was declared a miracle. Before he could walk, he was a symbol, the long-awaited son who would secure the Tudor bloodline. But the man who sired him was already dying, body rotting from within, mind clouded by paranoia and guilt. And so Henry's final gift to his child was not wisdom, not tenderness, but a crown forged in terror. When the old king's coffin was sealed, the boy's life ceased to be his own. Courtiers closed around him like vultures circling a fresh kill. They dressed him in silks he did not choose, placed him on a throne he could not see over, and spoke to him as if he were already divine. Behind every bow was an ambition. Behind every prayer a plot. His guardians, men of learning, men of greed, shaped him in their image. The Duke of Somerset, noble and vain, whispered of glory. Archbishop Cranmer murmured of prophecy, of a kingdom reborn in Scripture. Each lesson Edward learned was edged with warning. That the world beyond the palace walls was impure, diseased, and in need of cleansing. That mercy was weakness, and obedience was godliness. So he listened, he watched, and behind those pale, unreadable eyes, the boy began to believe them. Every morning began in prayer, every evening ended in silence. Servants walked softly in his presence, as if afraid their breath might offend him. He studied the Bible as others studied warfare. He wrote his thoughts in neat, elegant script, reflections not of a child, but of a zealot in miniature. He recorded deaths with the same detachment others reserved for weather. When one of his uncles was executed, he wrote only, "The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off. No grief, no fear, only order." Outside the castle gates, the people saw portraits of a gentle prince. Golden hair, fair complexion, eyes turned heavenward. Inside, his tutors saw something harder forming. a conviction that he alone could save England from its sins. And yet, beneath the polished manners and quiet voice, there flickered the spoiled child Henry had made him. A boy told from birth that he was special, that all must bow, that God himself had chosen him. He never saw the starving peasants outside Westminster. He saw only blasphemers who refused to change. When he spoke of his kingdom, he called it his flock. When he spoke of rebellion, he called it infection. And soon this child king, this frail vessel of faith and fury, would be asked to prove his devotion. The fires that once consumed his father's enemies were waiting for new kindling. Before we go deeper into his reign, tell me where you're watching from. Which corner of the world hears the echo of England's ghosts? This is Echoes of Time, and the story is just beginning. Faith was meant to guide him, but in Edward's hands, it became a blade. The boy who prayed more than he slept now ruled a kingdom at war with its own soul. Every chapel, every altar, every word of the old religion trembled under his gaze. The faith of England had been cracked by his father, but Edward would grind it to dust. He sat beneath the painted ceilings of Whitehall, listening as his councilmen spoke of heresy and order, of souls to be saved and sinners to be broken. To him, it was simple. God's truth was his law, and anything else was treason. And so the purges began anew. Across the shires, the Book of Common Prayer was forced upon the people. Latin, the tongue of their fathers and faith, was outlawed. The Mass, which had carried comfort to the dying and hope to the lost, was branded superstition. Priests were dragged from their pulpits, their vestments torn from their backs. Those who clung to the old rites whispered prayers in barns and forests, afraid even of the wind that might carry their words to the wrong ears. The chantries, once places where the dead were remembered and the poor were fed, were dissolved by royal decree. Their gold melted into coin, their walls torn down stone by stone. For Edward it was purification. For England it was desecration. Imagine walking into a church your ancestors built, only to find its saints beheaded and its altars cold. The holy paintings slashed apart. The candles gone. The smell of dust where incense used to rise. That was the New England, cleansed of beauty, emptied of mercy. And through it all, the boy king's faith grew brighter, harder, sharper. He wrote of triumph, of a kingdom rising purified from sin. His eyes, say those who saw him, gleamed not with joy, but with conviction. The unshakable kind that leaves no room for doubt, no space for pity. Even his closest allies began to whisper that he was too devout, too certain, too young to understand the suffering his holiness demanded. But Edward did not hear them. He believed he was remaking England in the image of God, his God. And in his England, there was no room for the old world. No space for relics. No forgiveness for resistance. No mercy for those who dared to pray differently. The kingdom bent under the weight of reform. But Edward saw only victory. If you've ever stood inside an old church and felt the hush of centuries, imagine watching it burn. If the past still moves you, tap the like button and stay with us here on Echoes of Time. Because the flames have only just begun to rise. Gold can buy loyalty, but it cannot buy peace. As Edward's faith consumed his conscience, greed began to consume his kingdom. The Reformation, once preached as salvation, had become an open market, and England a body being stripped for parts. The nobles who surrounded the young king smiled as they prayed, but their hands were never still. Every law they passed in God's name lined their own coffers. Every sermon about holiness ended in the selling of another church, another field, another soul. The great estates that once belonged to monasteries were seized and sold. Sacred chalices melted down for silver. The roofs of abbeys torn apart to sell their lead. The poor who had once depended on those houses for food, shelter, and care were left wandering the roads, nameless and unwanted. But the worst wound came from the land itself. Where peasants had once plowed the soil their families tended for generations, fences now rose. Cruel, unyielding, endless. Enclosure, they called it, a word as polite as it was devastating. The sheep of the wealthy replaced the children of the poor. Whole villages vanished, swallowed by the hunger of landlords who wanted profit more than people. The fields grew quiet, the markets emptied, and those who begged were branded as criminals. Men were whipped for stealing bread, women hung for stealing wool. England, the so-called nation of the faithful, was starving under the hand of its godly king. Inside his palace, Edward saw none of it. To him, the reforms were progress, divine order made visible. He was told that the suffering outside was the price of purity, that God demanded sacrifice, and Edward believed it. The boy who was never denied anything could not imagine hunger. The king who preached charity had never seen desperation. He read reports of vagrants hanged and villages cleared as one might read weather, a record of necessary misfortune. To him, the kingdom was a map, not a people. Lines and figures, not faces and cries. The poor prayed for a king who might see them, but Edward prayed only for a kingdom that would please God. And yet, even as England bled, the fire in its people did not die. The whispers of rebellion began to stir, in taverns, in barns, in the corners of churches that still smelled faintly of incense. The farmers spoke of the land that was once theirs. The faithful whispered of the prayers they still dared to say. The boy king's England was about to answer him, not with prayer, but with uprising. These stories remind us that history isn't just kings and crowns. It's hunger, it's defiance, it's survival. Tell me in the comments what part of history still feels alive where you are watching from. This is Echoes of Time, and the storm has only begun. England can endure silence, can endure hunger, but it cannot endure being ignored. By 1549, the kingdom Edward ruled only on parchment had begun to twist and tremble beneath him. The peasants who once bowed their heads now clenched their fists. The farmers who whispered in anger now spoke aloud. And the old believers, those who still clung to Latin prayers and sacred rituals, refused to be erased. The spark came from the west, from the rugged fields of Devon and Cornwall, where the land remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it. There the people rose, not as rebels but as worshippers defending the only faith they had ever known. They stormed the churches newly stripped bare, demanding the return of the old Mass, the old language, the old England. What began as a plea became a march. What began as a march became a war. The prayer book rebellion swept over the countryside like a storm wind. Families marched with rosaries hidden beneath their clothes. Farmers carried scythes instead of swords. Mothers held their children's hands as if they were walking to Judgment Day. But Edward did not see them as subjects. He saw them as defiance, as disease, as infection in the body of the nation he believed he was cleansing. His regents sent armies, trained, armed, and merciless, against men who had nothing but faith and rage. The fields turned red. The rivers ran dark. Whole villages vanished in a single afternoon. England had not known such slaughter since the Wars of the Roses, and it would not see such brutality again for generations. Yet even as the West burned, a second rebellion was rising in the East. Not for faith but for survival. In Norfolk, the dispossessed gathered beneath the banner of a tanner named Robert Kett. The farmers whose lands had been fenced, whose livelihoods had been stolen, whose families starved while nobles fattened, rose in numbers no one expected. They built their camp beneath the oak at Mousehold Heath, looking down on the city of Norwich, as if daring the crown itself to argue with the earth that had betrayed them. Here were men who had plowed fields now locked behind wooden walls. Men who had watched their homes swallowed by greed. Men who had buried children whose only crime was being born poor. Their anger shook the kingdom. Their courage terrified the court. Edward's council begged him for patience, for compromise, for mercy. But the boy king had been raised to believe rebellion was sin, and sin must be punished. Once again the armies marched. Once again the blood of common men watered the soil that was once theirs. Once again England cried out, and the crown did not listen. By autumn, both rebellions lay crushed, their leaders executed, their followers hunted, their hopes buried beneath the boots of the king's soldiers. But something had changed in the soul of England. The people who once mumbled their suffering now spoke of tyranny. Those who once prayed for deliverance now prayed for survival. The kingdom that had knelt for centuries began, slowly, quietly, to rise. If you've made it this far, you're among the few who walk with us through history's darkest corridors. Subscribe to Echoes of Time and stay with this story, because the wounds of these rebellions did not fade. They festered, and they would come back to haunt the boy who caused them. Power changes men. But for Edward, it did something far more dangerous. It convinced a child that he was untouchable. In the wake of the rebellions, England expected a king who would learn, a king who would soften, a king who would finally see the suffering his laws had carved into the land. Instead, the boy grew colder, sharper, more certain. The blood spilled in Devon, Cornwall, and Norfolk did not shake him. It reassured him. To Edward, rebellion proved that the people were unruly, corrupt, and in need of stricter guidance. To Edward, mercy was a gate through which sin could slip back into the kingdom. And through that gate, he believed God would judge him. So he closed it, without hesitation, without remorse. Inside the chambers of Whitehall, the young king transformed. Gone was the shy child who hesitated before speaking. In his place stood a youth who issued commands with the calm confidence of a man twice his age. Servants noticed first, the chill in his voice, the way he observed them as if they were instruments rather than people. The boy who once scribbled prayers in the margins of his books now wrote instructions with the precision of a scribe preparing sacred law. He monitored the kingdom obsessively. Grain prices, executions, arrests, sermons, even whispers reported by informants. He read every account of disorder with a tightening jaw. He annotated reforms with a steady hand, pressing the quill so hard the ink bled like bruises across the page. Yet beneath this veneer of control, the royal court rotted. Somerset, once his protector, fell from power, undone by scandal, disaster, and his own arrogance. His downfall unfolded like a slow-motion tragedy. It taught Edward a lesson he took to heart. Affection is a liability. Loyalty is a lie. Power is survival. And so the boy withdrew. He confided in no one. He trusted no one. He smiled rarely, and when he did, it never reached his eyes. Northumberland rose next. A man of ambition hidden behind elegance, a serpent sheathed in silk. He guided Edward's reforms, fed his sense of divine purpose, encouraged his obsession with purity. Some said he treated the king like a prophet. Others whispered he treated him like a puppet. The truth lay somewhere in between. Edward believed in his own destiny, but Northumberland believed in opportunity. Day by day, the king's worldview narrowed. The suffering outside the palace walls became abstractions, numbers in a ledger. The cries of the poor became background noise, unfortunate but irrelevant. The pleas of Catholics, traditionalists, and exhausted peasants became nothing more than proof that the kingdom still needed cleansing. And still Edward prayed, for strength, for purity, for an England forged in the true faith, even if it bled along the way. As his body began to fail him, coughing fits, night sweats, the slow wasting of youth into pallor, his certainty only grew. He believed illness was a test. He believed reform was a divine race he had to finish before God called him home. Every decree became sharper, every punishment harsher, every word more final. The kingdom watched its young king shrink in flesh but swell in fervor. He had been England's hope, now he was its fear. Outside his windows, winter crept across the land. Inside his chambers, a colder season was settling. One made not of frost, but of conviction. Edward VI was no longer simply a boy with a crown. He was becoming something far more dangerous. A dying king desperate to reshape a kingdom before death silenced his hand forever. And England was running out of time. England was trembling long before the court dared to admit it. Not from rebellion this time, nor from heresy or hunger, but from the quiet collapse of the boy who ruled her. Edward's illness began like a whisper, a cough behind a closed door, a faintness during council, a pallor that even the brightest torchlight could not disguise. At first the nobles ignored it, then they denied it, then they feared it. For England had tied its future to a single fragile thread, and that thread was fraying. Inside the palace, the air grew heavy with secrets. Doctors came and went, carrying bowls of dark phlegm and silent dread. Priests murmured prayers outside the king's chamber, though they dared not speak them aloud when he was near. Edward hated the old rites. He saw them as poison, and so even death had to tread carefully in his presence. He was 16, and already watching his body betray him limb by limb. But even as his strength ebbed, his will hardened like iron heated in a forge. If God meant to test him, then Edward would prove worthy. If his body failed, then his faith must not. He wrote edicts from his bed, voice thin but unwavering, ensuring that no part of England slipped back into the shadows of the old religion. His coughing fits grew violent. Yet after each one he demanded new reports of sermons delivered, altars broken, churches purified. His dying breath became a kind of fuel, driving him ever deeper into the conviction that England must be remade before he returned to the God who had chosen him. But the council saw what he wouldn't. They watched the king's hands tremble as he signed decrees. They watched his skin stretch thin across his bones, watched the sweat gather at his temples, watched him struggle to rise and pretend he did not. They saw a boy burning himself alive in the name of God, and fear tightened its grip. If Edward died without an heir, the crown would pass to Mary, his Catholic sister, the woman he believed would undo everything he had built. To Edward, she was not just a threat, she was the undoing of his divine mission. So he made one final decision, one final act of faith. He drafted a new order, scribbling with shaking hands, choosing not Mary, but Lady Jane Grey, the quiet, educated cousin who shared his Protestant zeal. A girl who had never asked for a crown, but whom Edward placed upon a road paved with blood. It was a choice made in desperation, in righteousness, in terror. A choice that would plunge England into a crisis deeper and darker than anything his short reign had yet seen. Because by the time Edward set down his pen, by the time he declared his cousin the rightful heir, his lungs were drowning him, his voice was fading, and the kingdom he was trying to save was already slipping beyond his reach. He had tried to rewrite the future, but death had already begun writing it for him. Outside, summer settled over England, warm, indifferent, bright. Inside, the boy king's room smelled of herbs and sickness, and every breath sounded like the ticking of a clock. Edward VI had reshaped England in flame and faith, but now the fire was guttering. The reformer, the purifier, the child raised on prophecy, was dying, and with his death, the entire kingdom would be forced to face the cost of his convictions. Stay with me, because the end of Edward's reign was only the beginning of England's reckoning. The boy king's final night came quietly. No thunder, no omen, only the slow, relentless unraveling of breath. The council stood outside his chamber, pale and restless, listening for the sound that would decide the future of England. Behind the door, the once pious prodigy, the child who believed he could rewrite God's will, now trembled beneath blankets soaked in sweat. Edward tried to pray, but the words caught in his throat, not because his faith wavered, but because his lungs could no longer carry the weight of sound. Each breath was a struggle, each exhale, a confession of how little time remained. He thought of the churches he had stripped bare, the altars he had torn down, the defiant peasants who had died for prayers he could not bear to hear. But he felt no regret, only urgency, only the burning conviction that England must not return to the world he called darkness. He whispered one last command to those who knelt at his bedside. Mary must not inherit his crown. His final fear was that she would undo God's work and plunge England back into the faith he had spent his childhood trying to destroy. A king dies as he lives. Edward died as a believer, rigid, certain, unyielding. When the final breath left him, it slipped from his lips like a secret. 16 years of prophecy extinguished in a single sigh. For a moment the room fell silent. Then the panic began. Because England did not have time to mourn. It barely had time to think. The council hurried to lock doors, control couriers, silence servants. They hid the king's death like a crime, terrified that Mary would seize the throne before they could crown Jane Grey. Outside the palace, London carried on as if nothing had changed. Children played in the street. Fishmongers shouted at dawn. Merchants argued over coin. No one knew that their king lay cold in his bed, or that the kingdom stood inches from chaos. Word spread slowly, first a whisper, then a tremor, then a wave that roared through the city like a storm breaking loose. Some wept, believing a saint had died. Others muttered, remembering the rebellions, the hunger, the ruined churches. Many simply watched the palace walls in silence, waiting to see who would walk out wearing England's future. Edward VI had ruled for 6 years. 6 years that remade the kingdom. 6 years that scarred it. And now, in the hour of his death, his legacy was already slipping from his grasp. His cousin Jane would be queen for 9 days. Mary would rise in fury. Blood would spill again. The boy who tried to save England through fire had instead left it smoldering, uncertain, divided, broken. The last gift he gave his kingdom was not glory, but a succession crisis that would haunt the Tudor dynasty forever. Edward VI, the child raised in blood and prophecy, believed he was shaping England for eternity. But in the end, England would shape itself, not through his will, but through the consequences of his reign. The fires he lit would burn long after he was gone, and the echoes of what he began still whisper through history today. What remains after the death of a king? In Edward's case, only questions, and a kingdom standing in the ruins of a child's convictions. The day after his passing, England felt different. Not lighter, not freer, just uncertain, as if the entire realm had taken a deep breath and wasn't sure whether to exhale. The reforms Edward had carved into the nation still smoldered like embers in a fireplace. Hot, unstable, waiting for the next gust of wind. The churches he'd stripped remained hollow. The fields still bore the scars of enclosure. The families torn apart by rebellion had not healed. The boy king's shadow lingered over the land he tried to sanctify. Some said he had been a martyr for the true faith. Others called him a tyrant wearing the mask of a prophet. Most saw him as what he truly was, a child placed upon a throne built for giants, armed with power he could never fully understand, and driven by men who believed their own salvation depended on guiding his hand. But England had no time for reflection, no time for grief. The machinery of monarchy roared awake, tearing the kingdom toward its next chapter. Within days, the council declared Lady Jane Grey the rightful heir. A teenage girl, fragile, brilliant, reluctant, dragged from her quiet life and thrust onto a throne soaked in panic. She had not sought power. She had not asked for the crown. Yet Edward's final demand made her the center of a storm that would reshape the realm. Mary Tudor, rightful by law and feared by reformers, refused to be erased. She rode through East Anglia gathering supporters, not just Catholics who longed for the Mass, but peasants who remembered Edward's cruelty, nobles who resented being controlled, and common folk who simply wanted a ruler whose beliefs did not demand their suffering. Edward's attempt to secure a godly kingdom had instead ignited a struggle for England's soul. And as Mary's forces swelled, London felt the tremor of inevitability. The council began to fracture. Whispers of betrayal echoed in palace corridors. Jane's supporters faltered, and the people, exhausted from years of fear and famine, chose the certainty of Mary's claim over the righteousness of Edward's dying wish. 9 days after her reluctant coronation, Jane Grey was dethroned. 9 days was all Edward's grand design lasted. 9 days, and his legacy collapsed like a cathedral stripped to its bones. Mary took the throne in triumph, not because Edward's vision had failed to reach her, but because it had never reached the people. The boy who believed he was creating a new England had left behind a kingdom that wanted only stability, not sanctity. Order, not ideology. A future, not prophecy. And so England turned the page, not gently, but with the force of a realm trying to shake off a nightmare. In the decades to come, his reign would be remembered not for its glory, but for its wounds, the rebellions, the hunger, the shattered churches, the cold, unwavering zeal of a child convinced he was chosen. Edward VI left no heirs. No dynasty, no lasting peace. Only questions carved into the heart of a nation. What happens when a boy raised in the shadow of a monster inherits his father's crown? What becomes of a kingdom ruled by faith without mercy? And how many generations must live with the scars left by a king who believed he was God's instrument? The echoes of his reign did not fade. They reverberated through Mary's fires, through Elizabeth's caution, through every monarch who learned, painfully, that a kingdom is not clay to be molded, but a living body that bleeds when pushed too far. And so Edward VI slips through history like a ghost, not the innocent scholar of portrait painters, not the pure prince of Protestant legend, but a reminder that even a child, given unchecked power and burning conviction, can reshape a nation in ways it may never truly recover from. His father left England wounded. Edward left it bleeding. And centuries later, England still carries the marks of the boy who tried to finish what the monster began.